Let's move on to the second 25-mark question of this paper. So, evaluate the level of contestability in the fragrance industry or another industry of your choice. Now, this, at time of recording, is of course last year's paper, and I remember speaking to examiners right after the paper. It's an absolutely horribly answered question, and why is that? And the main reason for that is very similar. If you go back and look at the 2022 paper, the 15-mark question in the section B, that also refers to contestability, and again, a lot of students had the same problem there. So it's a recurring problem with this part of the spec, and I know why. Students just seem to neglect this part of the spec a lot, since it's a very small part of the spec, but like this shows, and a very recent example, you can get 15-mark questions in 2022 on it, and then in this example, a full 25-mark question. And it refers to specifically this spec point, 3.4.7, but what specifically about it? It's mainly the difference between, this is the problem, students will probably have revised this, but again, this is why the live classes are so important, since you don't just need to revise the spec points, you need to actually know how it comes up in exams and how you asked about it, what the high yield bits of this spec point actually are. So students would have revised contestability, but then the main bit of the spec point is knowing the difference between contestability and competition. And like I said, in this question and last time it came up, 2022 question 6E, that was the main problem. Now, if you haven't revised these, they sound very similar, and you can, unfortunately, fall into talking more about competition rather than contestability. So what is the difference between these two? Competition is simply the number of firms actively competing in the market. The number of firms. And we learn different examples of this. For example, in perfectly competitive markets, there's lots of firms competing in a market. In an oligopolistic market, there's about 5 to 10 firms usually competing in an oligopolistic market structure. In a pure monopoly, there's no firms competing, since the definition of a pure monopoly is one firm with 100% market share. But then you have a more realistic example, as a pure monopoly is slightly more theoretical now, which is a legal monopoly, which is a firm with over 25% market share. And what are some good examples of that? Tesco currently has a 28% market share, which shows there'd be a few firms competing in that market structure. And who is that? And a really good example of that competition is the supermarkets industry. Of course, we have the big firms like Tesco, Morrisons, Sainsbury's, Asda, Lidl, Aldi, etc. So that's an example of competition. But then what is contestability? Contestability is simply the threat for new firms entering the market. For example, if a market structure has low contestability, this would suggest things like high barriers to entry. Why? Since it's hard to enter that industry, there's low levels of contestability. A great example of that would be airlines, for example. Massive sunk costs, as it takes lots to set up an airline industry. For example, planes are very expensive, requires heavy financial backing, lots of brand loyalty in that market. So somewhere like airlines would be a great example of low contestability. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we have a highly contestable market. This would suggest low barriers to entry, low sunk costs, no economies of scale, things like that. And a great example of that, which I'm sure a lot of you will relate to, is like dropshipping. Dropshipping, there's no real startup cost, there's no sunk cost, we would say. Therefore, it's very easy to get into dropshipping. It's very cheap for new entrants to enter the market, thus a highly contestable market. And the reason why people get confused between these two terms, contestability and competition, is yes, they are very similar, but you need to remember their distinct differences. And of course, whenever we talk about entry, so we talk about barriers to entry, also if it's a highly contestable market, it means the barriers to entry are quite low, and also the barriers to exit are quite low as well. So they both work hand in hand. The main problem I saw with students' responses on this contestability question is students forget that if a market has low contestability, it does not matter if there's 100 firms competing in the market. Contestability is totally separate from competition. You need to remember this. A market can have very low levels of contestability, but can be highly competitive. So there might be 1,000 firms competing in a market, even though it's very hard to enter the market. And that's what confused a lot of students in this question. And to quote Edexcel directly in response to this question, in a contestable market, it is not the number of firms that is important, but the ease to which a potential competition can become actual competition. So it does not matter about the number of firms, it's all about how easily or potential competition can become actual competition. Back onto the question, so we've cleared up this main misconception, which will of course allow us to now achieve that top level, that 20 plus, as if you are getting confused between contestability and competition, you will be totally limited, won't score anywhere near the top marks. But of course, this question is still asking us to refer to an industry of our choice. In the live classes, we pretty much teach two examples for this. The first one is, of course, the supermarkets example, which I'm sure a lot of you are quite familiar with. Now, for this question, this isn't the example we're going to use, but let's quickly and briefly go through it, since a lot of students will use this example. And by the way, the examples I give, you can use any other example from any other industry. I would just suggest if you're going to use any other example, make sure you're ticking the right points. You're hitting the marking points, essentially. This isn't the example I'm going to use for this question, but let's see how supermarkets show a low level of contestability. First and foremost, it's all to do with the sunk costs. So of course, the supermarket industry has a very high sunk cost. Why is that? To set up a supermarket, of course, you need things like warehouses, supply chains, like distribution centres, full mechanisms how to do it. And of course, what do we define sunk costs? If a firm leaves the market, these are costs that a firm cannot recover. And lots of those things I've just mentioned are costs that firms cannot recover if they left the market, thus suggesting very high sunk costs. Even the simplest things, you think about the supermarkets, like the massive Asda supermarkets, the massive Sainsbury's supermarkets, it's not just the physical place itself, it's the investment they put into that supermarket, all the shelves, all the meticulous bits of detail they have in those supermarkets. They would not be able to get those costs back if they left the market. Thus, supermarkets do have a very high level of sunk cost. And since sunk cost is definitely going to be one of your major paragraphs if you're talking about this, I want to go into even more detail and a few more examples. Things like even branding. If you go into one of these supermarkets, there's infinite amount of branding, like on literally every single packaging, on every single turn you take, there's some sort of Asda branding. So of course, that is a pure definition of a sunk cost. Why? Since they can't sell that to the next person that's going to buy this warehouse, since that is completely for themselves, and if they left the market, they cannot recover that cost. And of course, a classic one, advertising. To build that brand image, firms, especially around Christmas time, they spend lots on advertising, and if that firm disappears, of course, that is a complete waste of money. Another great and really specific one is employment. So of course, these supermarkets need workers, they need staff, and specifically staff training. A lot of people forget, a lot of students forget that staff training takes time. For example, it takes time for maybe someone supervising them, maybe a manager supervising them, maybe them learning from the company itself. It takes resources, it takes manpower, it takes hours. Therefore, it costs the company when they are training up staff. And of course, if the supermarket closes, all these hours they've invested into the staff, they of course cannot receive any return on that. And a really great example of this is Aldi. Aldi and Lidl are notorious for not taking on staff that they believe will leave within a year. As of course, it's a misallocation of resources. It's a waste of resources if they hire individuals who leave after a couple of months, once they've invested all that time, that money into training these individuals. Therefore, they stick with candidates who they usually a bit older, as they know they will need a stable, secure job. As for example, if you have a mortgage, you're much less likely to leave your job rather than just a school kid, maybe 16-year-old, who just needs a bit of cash on the side. And of course, this is not to do with this question, but of course, these examples, they can be applied to many different questions, and we can see these efficiency cuts that Lidl and Aldi, these discount supermarkets, are making, are representing in the market share. For example, Aldi and Lidl now make up just around 20% of the complete market share in the UK supermarket industry, and Aldi has taken over Morrison's in terms of market share, and Lidl is currently around 8%. It looks like it will take over Morrison's very soon. And with firms like Asda declining year on year and Tesco only growing like a modest 0.7%, you could see in the future, in the next 10 years, these discount supermarkets really dominating the industry. Moving on to the second feature, which contributes to the low contestability in the supermarket industry, of course, it is economies of scale. Like I was saying, with these efficient supply chains, with these massive deals, with these manufacturers, with the suppliers, and with them, of course, outputting millions per year, it does contribute to the economy of scale, and of course the internal economy of scale. They can really exploit them. As you can see on the diagram, they're able to run down their long run average cost. How do they do that? With things like the main economy scale I always talk about, purchasing economy of scale. They have massive bulk buying power. You can even talk about how supermarkets have a degree of monopoly power over suppliers in the UK, especially of like milk and wheat in the UK. Since, for example, like the big 7 supermarkets, they buy most of the supplies of farmers. Therefore, they can act collectively as a monopoly, and they have monopoly buying power where they set the prices they want to pay these farmers, and the farmers due to the lack of other options they almost have to accept. So again, but onto economy of scale, of course, purchasing, they're bulk buy. Then we have technical economy of scale, for example, specialist capital, even things like self-scan. What did they do? Of course, they replaced workers' jobs, but it's specialist capital, which yet what has it done? It's reduced cost for the firm, therefore made them more efficient and again lowered their cost. For example, just to emphasize this, and a nice little stat which your examiner will appreciate if you do remember it, we throw it in the life classes often, is 4 pints of milk in the UK. If you go to Tesco, buy some semi-skimmed milk, cost you about £1.55, and this is estimated to cost Tesco about 87 pence. Now, of course, that is neglecting the overhead costs which of distribution, but that is a main stat which you can use to mention where they can use their monopoly power, they can use their purchasing economy scale to run down the prices, to run down the costs, therefore allow them to make that overhead, and in that scenario they make a profit of around 68 pence, 69 pence I believe. But yeah, it's a really good start and a nice unique one. Also, with regards to the smaller economies of scale, you could mention marketing economies of scale. Of course, Tesco, Asda, they have massive online presences, and one of the main, and just massive presences in general, and one of the reasons for that is years, decades of advertising. Now, if you think about the big four supermarkets, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, how do they have such a large presence in the UK? It's just due to decades of advertising. Now, how are they able to justify this advertising? It's due to the output and just how marketing economies of scale suggests. They're able to spread these advertising costs over thousands, millions of units, therefore reduce their overall average cost, therefore exploit their economies of scale. But now, moving on to the third and the last big one, has to be brand loyalty. And now, when you think about brand loyalty, only one supermarket should come to your mind, which is definitely the most popular and the supermarket that has executed it the best. Thus, you can see with the incredible market share for the UK supermarket industry is Tesco's Club Card. Tesco's introduction and execution of the Club Card is nothing but revolutionary. It changed the industry. Around 80% of UK households have a Tesco Club Card, and around 80% of Tesco sales come from their Club Card. So it really shows the magnitude and the extent to how effective this Club Card is. Since why is it so effective? Also, with regards to competition, since it keeps consumers coming back to Tesco and away from competitors. Why? Since they want to rack up those points for the Club Cards. So, for example, they see two of the same supermarkets on opposite sides of the street. Where they're going to go, their brain is going to prompt them to go to Tesco, since they rack up points for future shops and maybe save money in the future. So it's absolute perfect execution and great delivery by Tesco. Now, I did mention I was going to briefly go through this example, but that's not what happened. I went through in quite a lot of detail, so I'm just going to stick with this example for this question. The second example I was going to go through was the online streaming industry. And for those of you who have done your past papers and preparing for that A-star, it will remind you a lot of that 2023 paper where it was on Disney, Amazon Prime, all of those. So that's a really good example of, again, another market with low levels of contestability due to a lot of these same reasons. Obviously, high sunk costs, economies of scale, brand loyalty, etc. But if you want to do a bit of your own research, feel free and leave a comment and I can add a bit to it. Now, how would I go about doing this? Literally, I would use these as paragraphs. The only thing I would do, I would probably do 2 paragraphs and use brand loyalty as an addition to one of the paragraphs. So it depends where you want to mention it. If you want to mention, if you're going to focus on advertising as one of the sunk costs, 100%, you can add in brand loyalty to that, since they spend lots in advertising, and the reason for that is developing brand loyalty. Or you can mention it in economy of scale, where marketing economy of scale. Why is that? Since we want to develop the brand loyalty through marketing, through advertising, so it will become a familiar face in a household. Now, of course, all these points are suggesting that supermarkets have a low level of contestability. So how would we evaluate these points? And what are some really good evaluation points here? A great one, specifically to do with supermarkets, and especially if you live in the UK, one you will 100% know, is about brand loyalty. Is you can mention this statement that consumers are not actually brand loyal in the UK, and they are loyal to prices, they are loyal to the location. So consumers don't actually really care whether they're going to Asda, Sainsbury's, anything like that. Besides the Club Card points, besides all of that, the thing they care about is the prices. For example, the reason why a lot of consumers have started shopping at Aldi, Lidl, these discount superstores, is that they're cheaper, very simply. They're cheaper than the rest of them. Even though in economics we talk a lot about these advertising budgets, how consumers have developed brand loyalty, you can say in supermarket and with regards to the necessity of food, there is a very low level of brand loyalty. And like I said, consumers are only loyal to location and prices. And of course, for the second point, we're talking about contestability, we're talking about barriers to entry with economy of scale. brand loyalty. So of course we have to mention regulation. So of course another great evaluation point depends on the level of regulation within the supermarket industry. In the UK we have almost 2 regulatory bodies for supermarkets. GCA regulate the suppliers, so make sure the suppliers for supermarkets are being treated fairly. A great example of that is Amazon Fresh, of course, a kind of newish supermarket. They weren't paying their suppliers on time, therefore they did risk a 1% fine of total revenue. So that's a good example of GCA regulation. And of course the overarching regulatory body, just like we've learned, is a CMA for supermarkets. But of course you can mention, depends on the degree of regulation within the UK supermarket industry, as if the CMA flags and it realises the supermarket industry has a very low level of contestability and needs more contestability to make sure consumers aren't exploited to lower prices. If the CMA believes the level of contestability is too low and is affecting consumer welfare, for example, consumers are being exploited, they can, of course, encourage competition / lower the barriers to entry with things like reducing regulation, stopping anti-competitive practices like limit pricing, price wars, predatory pricing, things like that, essentially, where the CMA can encourage new firms to enter the market if they want to. But yeah, depends. Another second great evaluation point depends on the level of regulation. Another great evaluation point you could mention is it depends on the degree of small firms entering the market. As yes, we don't see many large supermarkets enter the market, but which of course suggests low levels of contestability. But we do see these small firms like local, ethically sourced shops. I'm sure you know a few of them, like maybe a lot of them are quite like vegan sourced things, but yeah, so these shops 100% are still entering the market, so it shows there is still a degree of contestability in the market. Yes, maybe not these massive incumbent supermarkets, but yeah, these small firms, which technically are still selling the same good, they're still selling food, are entering the market and are, even though very minimally, are still stealing a degree of market share. But yeah, that is pretty much all I'm going to say for this question. Like I say, remember the main points. First main thing is that past papers, do them all, since, like I said, doing all the past papers gives you such an advantage. As you can see here, this question is very similar to that June 2022 question, 15-mark question. So like I said, if you've done those, there's a massive probability that you do all the past papers, something similar comes up in your exam. It's almost a guarantee that something very similar will come up in your exam, which of course means you'll score so much better if you've done the question, looked at the mark scheme, had it marked, had feedback on it. But yeah, that is 2024 paper 1 done. I hope that has helped. I hope that has cleared up a few misconceptions. Any questions, do leave it down in the comments. Please do make sure, share with your friends, share with your classroom. If you have a Google Classroom, share the link in there, email it to your teachers. But yeah, nothing else. Also, if you would like any more help, we have a ton of resources on the economics website, youdoecon.com. It should be up and running by the time you're watching this video, and I hope this has helped.